All right, hello everyone. My name is Mene Ukueberuwa. I am a writer at the Wall Street Journal editorial page, and I'm going to be moderating our discussion entitled, Affirmative Action Reconsidered, Do Blacks Need Special Treatment to Succeed? And so I wanted to give a little introduction to the topic because I think it would be almost impossible to overstate the importance that affirmative action was meant to have in the post-civil rights push to advance the place of blacks in this country. You can think of affirmative action as one of two twin pillars that sort of racial progressives proposed in the aftermath of the civil rights movement. Of course, the first pillar is wealth redistribution and the anti-poverty programs of the Great Society. Those were supposed to essentially lift the floor, bring blacks out of poverty and give better prospects to the least among us. And in this crowd, I don't think I have to work too hard to convince people that that first pillar has already crumbled, and we've seen that the Great Society programs have not had the effect that they were intended to have. We can say the same thing about affirmative action. 50 years on, we have seen that it has failed to create a sort of stable black upper class proportionate to the size of blacks in the American population. But not only has it failed to do that, it also has opened up significant problems in American society. There is an ongoing legal debate about whether affirmative action is even legal at all, about whether it comports with the Civil Rights Act and with the Constitution. There is a debate over how effective it is, even for the people it's trying to help. And finally, there's a debate over whether it's fair to discriminate against whites and increasingly against Asians in the push to include more blacks in elite academic institutions and in the workforce. And so today I'm going to be joined in this discussion by three panelists here. Directly to my left, we have Gail Heriot, who is a professor at the University of San Diego School of Law, and also is a member of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. We have next to her Kenny Shue, who is president of Color Us United, which is an advocacy group that pushes for meritocracy and colorblindness in the workforce and elsewhere. And finally, we have Devon Westhill, who's president of the Center for Equal Opportunity, which monitors civil rights across different sectors of public life. So please join me in welcoming our panel. So the issue of affirmative action has been very timely as of late because we are finally seeing a return to federal litigation, which is going to question whether it's legal to begin with. There is a case being brought by an advocacy group called Students for Fair Admissions, which is suing Harvard University and also the University of North Carolina for their discriminatory actions. They just last week filed their brief to the Supreme Court. An oral argument is going to be heard this October. Kenny is actually involved with that case, sort of as an advocate, and so I was wondering if you would be able to describe to us what is the argument that Student for Fair Admissions is making about affirmative action from a legal standpoint, and what is your perspective on the prospects of that case?
So I am Kenny Shue. I'm the author of the new book, An Inconvenient Minority, The Attack on Asian American Excellence and the Fight for Meritocracy. I'm also on the board of Students for Fair Admissions, so we are litigating that case. We are in the Supreme Court. We are fighting tooth and nail for equal rights and meritocracy. And ultimately, that's what this case is about, right? There's a reason why this case got so much attention, and it's not just because it's just one school and the most popular school in the entire world, Harvard University, but it's because of what it stands for. So Students for Fair Admissions filed a lawsuit against Harvard University way back in 2014, alleging that Asian Americans are discriminated by Harvard in the name of so-called diversity. And Harvard, who wants to admit a preferred ratio of blacks and Hispanics, and also wants to keep their white legacy core intact and children of donors intact as well. In fact, I think 10% of the admits to Harvard last year were children of donors or influential alumni. So they want to keep all of that part, so they have to cut out somebody, right? Somebody has to be cut out. If you're going to prefer blacks, you're going to prefer Hispanics, you're going to prefer legacies, you're going to prefer children of donors, and you're going to prefer athletes, somebody's got to be cut out. Well, who's going to be cut out? Well, it turns out the people that they decided was the easiest to cut out of the equation are high-achieving Asian Americans. And in fact, Asian Americans have to score 440 points higher on the SAT to have the same chance of admission as a black person, and 150 points higher to have the same chance as a white person. And basically, this case is asserting that, hey, you have no right to abandon the principles of meritocracy for the sake of your preferred ratios. And right now, that case is being litigated in the highest court of the land.
Mm-hmm. So to continue on the sort of the legal dimension of affirmative action, I wanted to ask if Gail would be able to follow up by talking about some of the history of how the court has treated it, because this is essentially round 3 in several landmark Supreme Court cases. We had UC versus Bakke in 1978, which basically said affirmative action is constitutional. That was affirmed by Grutter versus Bollinger in 2003, and I know that through your work, you have studied these legal questions, so I wondered if you could be able to sort of inform us what are the trickiest parts of getting a stable legal solution in terms of should affirmative action even be allowed whatsoever?
Alas, it's all tricky. I should footnote before I start, though, and I'm required to say this, ladies and gentlemen, it won't shock you. Nothing that I say should be construed as the opinion of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. So I've said it. They're going to be happy now in Washington. Mm-hmm. So what's the law in this area? If you look back to 1964, Title VI is very clear. It bans race discrimination in any federally funded activity, and just about every university, not quite, but almost every university in the country receives federal funds. So you would think this is easy. You cannot discriminate on the basis of race. But it's not so easy. Alas, in the Bakke case in 1978, we had a split decision, 4-1 and 4. 4 justices said, look, you look at Title VI, it's easy. It says no race discrimination. It was very, very clear that the University of California Davis Medical School was discriminating on the basis of race. And those 4 justices said, this is simply illegal under Title VI. They didn't even have to get to the constitutional question. Then there were 4 justices who said, well, it says that you can't discriminate on the basis of race, but it doesn't really mean that. What it really means is that you can't violate the Constitution. And the Equal Protection Clause is a little bit, it's more general. It doesn't say specifically you can't discriminate on the basis of race. Instead, it says equal protection under the laws. And those 4 justices took the position that, hey, if it's the good kind of discrimination, then we're willing to put up with it. And one justice, the man in the middle, Justice Lewis Powell, had kind of a quirky position. He went through several possible reasons that a university might be willing to discriminate and said, hey, if you're doing it because you are trying to improve the education for all the students, you have a pedagogical reason to engage in discrimination, as long as you're not doing it on the basis of clear quotas, and the University of California was. So Powell took the side of Alan Bakke, but he said, hey, in the future, though, if a university does it on a more of an abstract, seeking diversity of all kinds, including race, including maybe athletics, including people who visited other countries, people who've been in the circus, people who've been, had any sort of background that would be different. He said that could be okay. And I think when he made that decision, he thought he was talking about sort of a narrow exception and that it wouldn't be abused. But boom, As soon as it was possible for a university to say, we're not doing this because we're trying to benefit a particular group, a particular race, we're doing it for diversity's sake. Every office at every university that had used the term, racial justice or affirmative action, they switched the name to diversity. But the door was opened wide to, I'm sorry to say, rather large preferences based on race. And I think we'll talk a little bit later about the effects that had. But as for the law, it meant for the next 20-some years, universities felt that they could discriminate, and they could discriminate quite a lot. The gaps were quite large. But that was just one justice's opinion, just one. It wasn't the majority of the court, and so those who were opposed to such preferences decided, well, we'll bring another case. And in the year 2003, I believe, 2 such cases reached the Supreme Court, Grutter versus Bollinger and Gratz versus Bollinger. Both of them were against the University of Michigan. Bollinger was the president of the University of Michigan at the time. One case was the college, the other case was the law school. The college was being very numerical. It was adding 20 points to the admission score of all students who were African American. And it was, 20 points sounds like, oh, it's not that many. It was huge. Basically, it meant that each African American student was treated as if they had gotten perfect SAT scores. So it was a very large number. And that, that was numerical, and the court didn't like that. Justice O'Connor, who ended up being the vote that mattered here, she was not willing to tolerate something that was that blatant. But the law school had a somewhat different process. They could claim, because they're small, law schools aren't large, law schools are small. You can look at every admissions package and look for everything that's in it, and they would just sort of eyeball it and decide whether or not to admit the student. But the preferences were actually just as large at the law school as they were at the college. They were, again, very, very large preferences that especially benefited African American students, but also Native American students, and also Latino students. But at the law school, they could say that they weren't engaged in a particular number. They would just eyeball it and decide who to admit and who not to admit. And so I think, sadly, Justice O'Connor on that one decided that she thought that Lewis Powell was basically right. That this should be tolerable. Although weirdly, she said that she only expected this to be something that would have to be done for the next 25 years. We're getting very close to the end of that 25 years. Mr. Westhill's organization, the Center for Equal Opportunity, did some investigation of whether or not those gaps were closing and whether or not the level of preference was going down at the University of Michigan a few years back before you started working there. But still, the gaps were getting larger instead of smaller, larger. And there were 2 more cases that reached the court. Fisher versus the University of Texas 1, and Fisher versus the University of Texas #2. I won't bore you with the details on those 2. Suffice it to say that in one, the court sounded like it was going to start, closing the door a little bit and getting towards the deadline of 25 years that Justice O'Connor had in mind. But it didn't turn out that way. In Fisher 2, nothing happened. So now it's before the court one more time. Is the court going to be true to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, to Title VI, and say there is no race discrimination in federally funded activities? Or will they punt again? I am not taking bets on this. I did take a bet on Grutter, and I lost. So I will just leave it there.
Sure.
Well, Gail invoked me, so if I could just start.
Go right ahead.
Yeah, so I'm Devon Westhill. I'm the president and the general counsel of the Center for Equal Opportunity. It's been around for almost 30 years, and the mission of the organization has been to advance colorblind equal opportunity in every sphere of American life, public and private, in the higher education sphere, employment, contracting, and the like, where affirmative action, or we like to call it exactly what it is, race preferences, is rampant. One of the things that we've done really well and often at the Center for Equal Opportunity over that period of time is to produce studies that report to the public on what exactly is going on in higher education when it comes to these preferences. And to circle back to something that Gail said, and I think we have to be kind of careful about how we talk about affirmative action, all of these issues that we've been discussing over the last day and a half, because I don't think that race preferences in college admissions is actually a benefit to those individuals who receive them, those quote unquote underrepresented minorities on campuses. I think we'll get into a little bit more about this in further discussion. But on its face, it sort of looks like it, right? Wow, I had lower than stellar credentials. I got into this school by the skin of my teeth. I've really accomplished something. But at the end of the day, we'll see, and I think in some of our conversation here, that it actually is just the start of something that's actually really not good for those individuals who get those sorts of preferences. And one additional thing before I stop here in my initial remarks is, what is affirmative action? Who is affirmative action for anyway? Is it for the blacks, the Hispanics, the Native Americans? Legally speaking, no. As Gail suggested, it's for the benefits that flow from a diverse student body. It's for whites. It's for whites to study, quote unquote, underrepresented minorities, blacks, Hispanics, Native Americans, and so on and so forth, like so many zoo animals. That's what affirmative action is actually for. Not for black Americans. And so the suggestion that affirmative action, even in the first instance, legally speaking, might be this special treatment for the advancement of blacks or for black success is hogwash. I'll stop there for now.
Sure. Well, I wanted to follow up a little bit because right at the end you got to a point that Gail was making, which was that the justification that's presented from affirmative action has changed through the years, both coming from the courts and then coming from the university administrators. In the very beginning, it was portrayed as a temporary action that was needed to undo the harms that discrimination had caused. This was coming right in the wake of Jim Crow, and so the idea is there's been explicit discrimination against blacks. They have attended subpar schools by law, and so we are going to basically have an affirmative action, literally, that pulls more of these blacks into selective schools and then puts them on a platform into sort of a higher realm in the workforce. As the legality of that theory started to break down, and also as the results weren't panning out, you saw this pivot to the purpose of it is just for the enrichment of the students. That's exactly why we have it. We want to have a diverse student body. And I do wonder, to push back on your point a little bit, Devon, do you really think that there's no benefit to having the white students who are going to go into elite positions of power in this country, many of whom have never experienced a black community, who might have negative stereotypes about blacks? Would you really say it would be a bad thing to have 4 years in these institutions where students from a background like that are gaining exposure to high caliber sort of black students and learn that there are a variety of experiences, that these skills do exist among black people, and to sort of create this melting pot in our universities?
A lot of what you just said presupposes a lot. So one of the things that it presupposes is that the individuals who are getting into these elite institutions, is the terminology that you use, are really the students that should be in those institutions and are going to be able to display those qualities that are important to dispel stereotypes that other students might have when they attend these institutions, just by being around them. The problem is when you're given these massive preferences for underrepresented minorities, for individuals who are academically not prepared. for the coursework at these institutions. Take an MIT, for example. These are the best of the best of the best of the best science, mathematics, technology students in the country, like Dr. Lowry, who went to MIT. When you put students who have been given a massive preference next to those students who have lived, breathed, slept mathematics and science and so on and so forth all of their lives, it only reinforces pernicious stereotypes about black people and brown people, that they are lazy, that they are actually stupid. And I don't think that at all is beneficial. I think that's actually really harmful. So no, I think it presupposes that you actually are going to have students who are on par with other students at these elite institutions, and that is just not the case when they're given these massive preferences to attend those schools. Now, I think there's a case that can be made for students who make it on their own. You know, I am not against diversity. I'm not against inclusion per se. I am against racial discrimination, and I am against anything that's going to perpetuate the pernicious stereotypes about black and brown people, which race preferences, massive race preferences on college campuses do.
Well, Mene, just real quick. You say that the whites don't know the black experience at Harvard. The blacks don't know the black experience at Harvard. 71% of the black students admitted at Harvard are from upper middle class or higher backgrounds, and 48% of the black kids admitted at Harvard are children of black immigrants, meaning that they do not bear any resemblance to the American slave trade. They don't have that lineage. So this goes into the discussion we've been having the entire day, the entire afternoon. But the kind of manufactured cosmetic experience that Harvard is trying to create for black people is a caricature of what blacks in America are really going through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I want to follow up with you, Kenny, for a moment. I think one of the justifications for affirmative action from the universities is that they're able to give a leg up to these underrepresented groups, blacks and also Hispanics too, theoretically without necessarily hurting sort of students who come from the more privileged groups. This was the rationale at the beginning. It's not that we're discriminating against, and the courts were very careful to probe this, but we're just giving a leg up to other students. Obviously, we all know that the math doesn't work there. You have a fixed number of spots that you can give up. If you're going to boost the representation of one group, that means you're necessarily going to have to take away from another group. But it's gotten even worse than that, and that's one of the points of the Students for Fair Admissions case. We've seen in this country the levels of Asian immigration increasing over the past few decades to the point that they're a much larger share of the American population than they historically have been. They continue to achieve at quite high levels, and yet looking at the admissions records of a school like Harvard, you've seen that there's essentially been a cap on the number of Asian students that they're able to admit. And so I wonder, Kenny, would you say that you've seen a kind of a change among Asian Americans in the mindset towards affirmative action, where they might have been less offended by this racial balancing, but are becoming more vocal and more politically active about the lack of fairness from the practice?
Yes, and none of this should be construed as the official argument of Students for Fair Admissions. But Asians in America have unique needs. And this is like, I get it, I'm generalizing, I get it. But in general, Asians in America are not lacking of, two-parent family structures or some of the things that we talk about culturally that plague some of the lower income communities. We arrive here with strong two-parent family structures. We arrive here with values of hard work. Asian Americans study twice as many hours as the average American. They study 13 hours a week. The average white person studies 7. The average black person studies 5. So Asian Americans have values built on meritocracy. Meaning that they count on the United States generally being a meritocracy for them to succeed. They count on the idea that talent and competence is rewarded in this country. And for a while that's worked. For a while that Asian Americans have become the highest income earning social group in the United States. They have been the most educated recently. But at the same time, what we have with this Harvard case is Harvard saying to Asian Americans, well, your talent and your hard work is going to fall in comparison to your race. And what you bring to the table, we're going to look at you based on characteristics that you cannot control about yourself. And to Asian Americans, that speaks to I think the reason why Asian Americans have become more emotional about this case is because it speaks to one of their frustrations in this country, which is their frustration for status. Their frustration for, well, we have worked really hard in this country, but still culturally speaking, it seems like we lack that cultural capital, that political capital to really take that step forward. And there's anxiety. There's a lot of anxiety among Asian Americans for that. And that really pains a lot of Asian Americans, and it pains a lot of Asian Americans to see what Harvard did with the personality score. That's another thing. A lot of Asian Americans that I've talked to who otherwise would not have cared about the Harvard case or would have even supported Harvard, when I bring up the fact that Harvard rated Asians lowest on the personality score out of all of the races, despite the fact that Asians got the highest teacher recommendations, highest alumni recommendations, second highest counselor recommendations. Personality score, according to Harvard, means likability, good humor, leadership skills, a Harvard man. And Asians just don't make the cut. They just don't make the cut. And to Asians, that speaks directly to the heart. Because, man, they're working so hard. They're studying, they're putting in the hours day after day, they're doing everything right. And Harvard uses that against them. They say they're test-taking robots with no personality. An essay that Peter Arcidiacono read, who was the lead witness in the Harvard case for students for fair admissions, who couldn't join us today. But there is an essay of a girl who is Asian, who grew up in foster care, and just was devastated in families and had that story, that rise from deprivation that supposedly is coveted by Harvard admissions officers. And they gave her the standard strong personality score, which means good but not good enough. And I can tell you 100% guaranteed, if that girl's race was changed to Black or Latino, that would not happen. So that's one of the issues that I think is at the heart of this for Asian Americans. This craving, this desire to be accepted, and Harvard throwing that in their face.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, please.
Can I add something here, and that is that history repeats itself. If you look back at Harvard University in the 1920s, same story. The Jewish quotas at Harvard were so similar to what Kenny is talking about now. And Lewis Powell in the Bakke case evidently didn't understand that. In the Bakke case, he actually says, Harvard has this program where they're looking for well-rounded people, and that makes sense to him. That actually was proposed as a way of keeping Jewish students out of Harvard. That the president of Harvard in the 1920s was a man by the name of A. Lawrence Lowell. And he was also president of an organization that was an anti-immigration organization. And he went to the Harvard faculty first and said, we've got too many Jewish students. He wasn't subtle about it at all. And he asked the faculty to adopt a policy under which they could strictly limit the number of Jewish students. And Jewish students then, as today, do quite well on the sort of tests and the sort of academic credentials. And so there were a large number of Jewish students that wanted to get into Harvard and were qualified under Harvard's rules. The faculty, to its credit, That first time, when Lowell came and just asked for a flat quota, they said no. They refused. And he came back the next year and said, well, we should be considering, whether students are well-rounded. This was not, an issue of well-roundedness. This was a ruse to limit the number of Jewish students. But the faculty heard that and they thought, well, that sounds nice. Yeah, we do in fact want students who are well-rounded, and today we want students who are well-rounded. But it was actually a way in which Lowell was attempting to limit the number of Jewish students. It was quite clear. There's documentation at this point that once Harvard did this and once other Ivy League schools did it, and they all did it, and very, very quickly they did it, that the number of Jewish students plummeted. Nothing else happened. Everything else was pretty much business as usual. But they simply cut the number of Jewish students. Then, as now, the argument, is, well, they weren't well-rounded, or Asian American students don't have good personalities. But that's not what's going on.
So far, we've covered a couple of the key failures of affirmative action over the past 50 years. We started with the question, is it legal? Answer, maybe, but probably not. And the second question, is it fair? And it seems like our answer is a resounding no. I wanted to finish on a final question, which is, does it even work for the blacks who it's intended to help? And I wanted to go to you, Devon, for that question. I'm curious, it seems like affirmative action helps to entrench a couple of harmful narratives. One is a narrative in the eyes of sort of whites, basically where every time they encounter a black student at school or a black employee in the workforce, they always have to wonder, is this person only here because they were given a special privilege? And it also entrenches a negative narrative in the eyes of blacks in the sense that it helps to create a mindset that our group is being locked out. We need these special privileges in order to be able to compete. And so I wonder, either speaking personally, speaking from your work, what do you think about sort of the role that affirmative action plays in entrenching these negative narratives? Yeah,
thank you for the question. So one of the questions is, what do you mean by does it work? Do you get more underrepresented minorities, blacks, Hispanics, et cetera, on your campuses because of affirmative action? I think that's the answer is yes, probably. Does it actually help blacks and other underrepresented minorities succeed? I would say no. As I suggested, the organization that I run, the Center for Equal Opportunity, has been studying this for a long period of time, and what we've seen is that when applicants are given these major preferences to go to schools, a number of really bad things follow from that. And we've talked about a few of those things already. But other things that we haven't talked about, and one of the biggest things is that these individuals who are full of energy and passionate about various, sometimes hard subjects like science, technology, engineering, and math, STEM subjects, get into a situation where they are not academically qualified for that. This is called mismatch theory. And we've seen that they disproportionately change their majors, right? They run into a brick wall. These students who would have been fantastic at slightly lower tier school, we're talking going from Caltech, right, to UC Davis or something like that, and would have otherwise been a black scientist, would have been a black mathematician, would have been a black engineer, would have had a fantastic career, end up settling for, and there's no knock on this, but a sociology degree or an English degree. And again, we need sociologists. We need folks who understand those disciplines as well. But when you're talking about black advancement into white collar, high level positions and so forth, which they otherwise would have been able to obtain and wanted to obtain, that is a scandal. It's a scandal to know that we would have had more, well, I don't know about more lawyers. We would have had more scientists, we would have had more technologists, more doctors and so on and so forth, if these folks had been paired properly with the school that would have made more sense for their preparation. That's number one. There's another thing I wanted to mention as well. What we've seen on campus very much accelerated over the last 10 or 20 years is this racial separatism on campus, right? Folks see themselves as being different, right? Blacks, other underrepresented minorities who are by and large given these massive preferences don't feel like they're fitting in well. The folks who are not getting these preferences feel like those individuals aren't fitting in well. They feel like there's something about them that is different than others. They are the other that's on campus. And so they create these affinity groups, right? And they separate themselves from the rest of the campus because, in part, they think there's something that's either wrong with them or there's something wrong with the institution or the people there. And oftentimes, these things fall along race lines. And so I think it's actually furthering racial strife and division, when we wouldn't otherwise, to quite the same extent, have that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to add a little bit about HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities, who I think help prove the point that Devon was just making, and that is we would have more black scientists, more black physicians, more black engineers if colleges and universities simply engaged in race-neutral admissions policies that weigh disproportionately black students who have terrific credentials. To get within 1 million miles of MIT, you have to have great credentials. But then there are some of these kids who've been like living and breathing science and engineering since they were like 2 years old. And then there are other, black students who haven't been doing that. Their parents are not scientists or engineers. They've got great credentials, but not quite what MIT usually gets. That student had been just, a little bit lower in the pecking order. They have done splendidly, and they'd have their Nobel Prize by now, probably. But HBCUs, they produce significantly more than their share of the black scientists and engineers. These are people who often go to college at an HBCU. They do well. They go to graduate school maybe in a mainstream university, get their PhD at a mainstream university, but they weren't thrown in initially with students who have higher academic credentials. So they were able to get, to learn what they needed to learn. Maybe they didn't get an even break in high school. Maybe the high school they went to did not, really cover their needs, but the college did. And by the time they're in graduate school, they're doing fine. And I think that's an important thing, that these schools have fulfilled that role. One may think, gosh, do we really want to have colleges that are disproportionately African American so that we have that kind of separatism? And it doesn't really matter what we think about that. What I think is important is that these schools are not they are not giving preferential treatment to African Americans. They're not doing it, you can be in the top of the class at these schools. And it's not just sciences and engineering. There are also studies that show just overall, black students are less likely to go and become college professors of any kind when they attend a school where they've gotten preferential treatment, because the sort of person that decides, hey, I love college, I want to stay here forever. Those are the people that think, and I'm good at this. Some students will outperform their entering credentials when they get into college. Some students will underperform theirs, but most students are going to perform in the general range their credentials say. And if schools are giving large preferences, that means that part of the African American experience in college is not getting the best of grades. But those students that do go to a school where their credentials put them in the ballpark and they get good grades, they think, hey, I like this. I like this. They go on to graduate school, they get a PhD in some subject, and they go on to become a college professor, which I can attest is a great job.
So kind of as one final closing point before we move to questions, I thought I'd ask if any of you have a response to this, which is that if you look at polls of affirmative action today, generally you find that a large majority of blacks aren't even necessarily in favor of some of these policies, or I should say it's not a large majority. But you'll find, for example, things like ballot measures. Should the University of California use racial preferences in its admissions? And you'll have about 53% of blacks saying no. And so it seems like this is one of many situations where affirmative action is not something that's being demanded by blacks in as much as it is something that's being pushed by a kind of a progressive elite, which includes many blacks, of course, and sort of these policies aren't necessarily in the best interest of the people who they're intended to serve. And I wonder if any of you have a quick response to that.
I have a response. No, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a response. So the organization that I run, the Center for Equal Opportunity, just released a study a few weeks ago analyzing some 2019 Pew Research data that polled over 7,000 people from black people, Hispanic people, Asian people, and Native American, I think. But what came out was exactly what you suggested when we analyzed this. Large majorities of the respondents thought the very first thing that should be considered when you're determining whether or not someone should be admitted to a university is test grades, scores, these sorts of measures of academic merit. The very last thing on the list, most of the individuals of all racial categories thought that race and gender should not at all be
In relation to a
considered.
famous person.
Yeah, that's right.
In relationship to a famous person.
And a relationship to a famous person. I have a couple of statistics here. So whites thought that by a 78% to 22% margin that race should not at all be taken into account. Blacks, 62%. A good majority said, don't take this into consideration at all. Now, it does beg the question whether or not the statement that you made, Mene, is actually true or whether or not it's mutually exclusive with the statement I'll make here, and that is, is this sort of a factor of not wanting to carry a stigma for the rest of your days that you were, and be demeaned as a diversity admit to a school or diversity hire at the employment level? I think about that myself as an alumnus of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, which is now being challenged alongside Harvard in their racial preferences scheme. I don't know whether or not I was admitted in part to that university based on being a black man, but it very well could be the case based on their zeal for race preferences and admissions. And I have to carry for the rest of my days this asterisk on my resume line that suggests that I could be just a diversity admit, that was some dispositive factor in admitting me to the university. It's not fair, and goes back to the fairness issue.
Mm-hmm. I'll just close with this, which is Jason Riley said yesterday that wokeness is a response to shield white people from being called racist. And that's the purpose of Harvard's race preferences. It's not to help blacks. It's not. It doesn't. It's so that Harvard administrators can tell the world how great and creative and diverse they are. That's what it's about.
Take some questions. Over here.
Hi, thanks. I'm glad you're all working on this issue, and I acknowledge the importance of it. But part of me also thinks that this is a perfect example of the way in which elite interests dominate the policymaking conversation. A couple of years ago, I went through the archives of the New York Times and looked at how many stories they did on disputes about admissions at Harvard versus how many stories they did on the dropout rate of high schools in New York City where they're based, and it was 24-1 or something like that. And the people in this country that I worry the least about, to be honest, are the ones who are maybe right on the verge of going to Harvard or otherwise have to suffer the indignity of going to Stanford or, God help them, being English majors at the University of Texas. Don't you think that this is, to a great extent, a problem or a conversation that is really dominated by the desire not to talk about other problems? We have all sorts of problems related to education. Who goes to Harvard Law and who has to go to, UCLA is not a huge problem, I think, in our society. Those people are going to do pretty well in either case.
Well, I'll tell you numerically why I think that even at the top level, this is such an important discussion, because there's a cascading effect in top black talent in the country. So what I mean by that is SAT scores of math above 700 are 55% Asian, 40% white, and maybe 2% black. And so basically, the top tier math talent among black Americans is unfortunately quite low comparatively to other races. And so that means that if Harvard uses, and the Ivy Leagues use affirmative action, race preferences, to bring in the most talented, the elite black Americans into the Ivy League campuses, and then also takes the ones that are maybe second tier or third tier in terms of elite, and I'm talking about this in math and science here, black math talent, STEM talent, then the second tier universities who also practice race preferences have an even smaller pool of really, really top tier, and then the third tier have basically no pool. So basically what happens because of this policy is you have the top tier universities facing problems in competitiveness, the second tier universities facing large problems in racial differences in competitiveness, and the third tier universities facing these extreme problems that are nearly impossible for them to mask without getting rid of things like the SAT, which they're now doing.
Yeah, I suppose maybe I'm just being a little bit of a class warrior about this, but I just tend to worry more about the social problems of the 70% of Americans who don't go to college at all versus the 30% who do and the 3% who are in Ivy League schools and involved in these disputes.
And I think one of the problems here is that this has been sort of the centerpiece progressive policy for the last, several decades. And as a result, there hasn't been enough emphasis on, for example, what's going on in K-12 schools. When Proposition 209 passed in California in 1996, and I should point out that under Ward's leadership here, I was involved in that campaign. I was co-chair to his chairmanship. When it passed in California, one of the really good effects, and there were lots of good effects, but this one was my favorite, was that there suddenly progressives started caring about what was happening at K-12, in particular for students from disadvantaged backgrounds, regardless of race. And for example, the University of California at San Diego finally, got around to thinking about, well, what can we do to help? And they started a school, the Prue School, that is particularly aimed at disadvantaged students. So people sort of woke up to the notion of we are not making the world better through race preferential admissions at elite colleges. That is not the answer to our problems. And we really need to start talking more about K-12. I would add, and I think everybody in this room may agree, we need to be talking about family structure as well. And that's the center, I think, of what we need to do. And basically, that Devon, Kenny, and I are up here talking about the issue that should have been put aside long ago. And we should have just said, look, race shouldn't enter into this. Let's start looking at where the problem really is. So basically, I agree with both you and Kenny.
Amen.
And can I just say, I like the question too, and I wanted to respond just to say that you're exactly right, and everyone else is exactly right that just responded to you. What another bad thing about race preferences is that it papers over those things that we ought to really be thinking about and focused on. And reflecting on my own life and thinking about this panel and thinking about the other part of the question, which was, do blacks need special treatment to succeed? I thought, well, how did I get here, right? To be giving this presentation here, to have a law degree, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, when I was born a poor black child in the South, raised by a single mother, with two siblings who didn't graduate from high school. Neither one of them graduated from high school. I went to the United States Navy when my brother went off to prison, and my sister was raising a son as an unmarried single teenager. Et cetera, et cetera. What is the special treatment that I received, right, that made me get to the point that I'm at today? And I think it's less special treatment. Actually, I think that many, many years ago, my hero Frederick Douglass said it right. Essentially, don't do anything with us, right? What we're going to do with the Negro? Don't do anything with us. Let us alone. I think it's more of I think McDonald's got this right, a special sauce and not a special treatment. There are ingredients that you can put into the soup to make the atmosphere such that you can create someone like me who came from poverty, single parent, black, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, to actually be someone who is now a lawyer and runs a think tank and speaks in an amazing place like this to really smart people. And it's not special treatment, and really affirmative action really papers over is what we really should be focused on. So great question.
Yeah. Up here.
I wanted to address really quickly what he was saying, because I know we're focused on this case because it's a high-profile case, but it has bigger ramifications. Solving education wasn't enough for me, so I got another job, and I'm a government contractor. And part of what I do is make sure their contractors meet these requirements they have. So hiring certain number of minorities and women. And there's a push and this would affect regular people because they would either own these companies or work for the companies. And so there's a push to try to change these minimums, which is like 25 and 5%, to mirror the society in the city where it is. So if you're in Chicago and it's 33, 33, 33, you need to have 33% of your minority contractors be black, right? So it has bigger ramifications, but beyond that, where are you going to get them from, right? So there's no incentive to make an engineer who makes good money, there's very few black engineers, he's doing well, to start his own firm. So I see it because I do it. So what happens is they have this minimum, which is not 33, it's 25, let's say. They can't meet it, so they get charged a fee. So they get an exemption. They say, look, we tried to hire as many black engineers as we could, we only found a couple, and they sign off on it. So until you make those changes, it won't make a difference. And this case is important because when they talk affirmative action, even though this is the elite schools, affirmative action, this will have ramifications across the board. So they would be able to do it if it's legal in all facets. So it's going to affect those other things. And that's what I think why it's important beyond just Harvard and other places like that.
Mm-hmm. Over here.
A couple of points. One is, I guess I'm the poster child of what you are, the antithesis of what you're talking about. Having been the first black to go to an Ivy League school and then walk into Congress, and also during my 3 or 4 year or 5 year period of time, 4 other blacks walked into Congress who were black. And guess who else walked into this? One person walked into the Supreme Court who was black, and one person walked into the cabinet who was black. I don't think any of us thought of ourselves as being preferential treatment. I think we're looking at it as fairness. Asians represent about 3% of the population, correct me if I'm wrong, and you get 12 or 13% of the people in all of these schools. Blacks represent about 15% of the population, and we have 8% of the people in this school. Talking about fairness. Also, I used to kid Cheney all the time. I said, Dick Cheney, it was easy to go to Yale for you. Why? Because you're from Wyoming. There's geographical preferences for people. It's easier to go to Yale if you're from North Dakota. It's easier to go to Yale or Harvard if you're from South Dakota. The interview is a factor. The interview is a factor in many instances. References are a factor. Essays are a factor. Interviews are a factor. There are a number of factors and not just the test score. Leadership roles that you had in your school, whether you're class president or whether you stood out by writing a book or something of that nature. There are a number of qualifications. My sisters could not go to a white school. It was against the law. It may as well have been. But one went on to Penn State University years later and was the first black to teach at the University of Tennessee. Another one taught at the UVA. Another one was a retired colonel. My father could barely read or write. He learned how to drive to North Carolina by memory. We all learned differently. He was brilliant. I taught at Georgetown for 9 years. You know, I was told at Georgetown, and I know there's a person representing at Georgetown here, I was told that I had to not grade Asian students based on their class participation because they don't participate historically. And I had to judge them by allowing them to submit their paperwork in writing and count it as class participation. Fact. So I'm touching upon your other point. And the biggest concern. Okay, one last point. It's a bigger issue. This gentleman said it. That is the bigger issue.
Can I get a response? I'm sure that many of you have thoughts to that critique of the fairness question.
Couple of thoughts here. One, you're right that it's easier to get into these Ivy League schools from Wyoming or South Dakota, and that was because that was part of the way in which they were trying to keep Jewish students out. And so that is very much a black mark against Ivy League schools that went down that road. That's why I'm a partisan for the University of Chicago, which didn't do that. So that's correct. On the other hand, you sound rather angry about it, and it's yeah, okay, passionate. But part of the passion, I fear, comes from people's fear that somebody's perceiving that they got a preference, and I think that's one of the problems with affirmative action.
I have
pardon?
I have very thick skin. I have attack my
Good, good. I'm in favor of thick skin. But the notion that groups should have their fair share of Ivy League positions, there's no group that has its fair share. There are some groups that are overrepresented, some groups that are underrepresented, and people tend to see it in terms of black, white, or sometimes they see it in terms of black, white, Latino, Asian. But the truth is, all of these groups have subgroups. If you break whites down into religion, Unitarians do splendidly at Ivy League schools. I mean, they're like some tiny fraction of 1% of the population, but they're like, they're overrepresented massively. On the other hand, Scots-Irish, no, you're not going to find too many Scots-Irish or too many, if you look at it in terms of religion, too many white Baptists, you just won't find them there. They aren't there. As J.D. Vance has written in his Hillbilly Elegy. That's a group that you just don't find on Ivy League campuses. And if we were to say all of them should be, there according to their percentages in the population, the world would look very, very, very different, and Harvard would not be Harvard. And if it's a good thing to have a Harvard, and that's something we can debate. Maybe we don't want elite schools at all, but I tend to agree with Kenny that we have to have schools that are at least elite with regard to science and engineering. I can see an argument against the level of eliteness that we get in our colleges today, that maybe it's not so great. Maybe we should have something that's a little bit different from that. But if you're looking for representation by race, it's just can't happen.
I think you and I want the same thing. You and I want the same thing. We want a more meritocratic process that evaluates people on the content of their character, not the color of their skin. You and I want the same thing. And it's tough. Meritocracy is tough. What are we really going to, what are the things that we really are going to use to determine who should get into this, who should get into that? I think there should be an objective component. I think SATs should be part of it. Some people disagree with me. I think that there should be an interview component, absolutely, because you need to test whether a person can do those kinds of things. I think you would agree with that too. You and I want the same thing. And the only thing that I think that is at the core of this discourse here is we're perceiving different aspects, and we're weighing them in different ways. But one thing is for certain. Race has no impact on your personal merit. It does not. It shouldn't.
Have time for one? Okay, we have time for one more question. I'm going to go over here. Yep.
I appreciate it because, when Charles Murray did that book, The Bell Curve, it got a lot of negative attention, but I think that he was trying to explore root of some of this problem. I mean, I cannot accept that black people just don't have the capacity to get to where they can, by their merit, get into these schools. So I'm against affirmative action, of course, but I'm just wondering, Gail, you mentioned family. When are we going to get to where we talk about the traditions that, gentlemen, I'm not sure your name yet because I just met you. Kenny said the Asian population already came in with these core values that are passed through family. Gail, you mentioned the Jewish population. They're passed through family. And yet, when it comes to African Americans, we pretend that this is not relevant to why we are so disproportioned in the ill of everything to allow them politicians and or schools or judges to come up with a solution. So I just want to put that on the table that if we really believe that African Americans have capacity, or Latinos, it sounds like you said, are falling behind to get into these Ivy Leagues, and I'm just really going to reject that we should all just go to historical black colleges because we just don't. And I didn't even know about them until I went to DC because they're concentrated more on this East Coast and Southern, and I'm from California. So I'm just wondering if you can speak to that. What needs to really be done at core if we got rid of all racial preferences, if we got rid of all welfare policy? Can we agree that this people group can excel?
Of course. You know, there are successful African Americans everywhere. You know, you couldn't go out on the street here in Dallas without running into people who've never received any sort of preference. They're black, and they've been very successful. You know, the world is full of them, and we need to be able to pass on that secret sauce. And that secret sauce, I believe, is mainly to be seen in issues of inculcating notions of personal responsibility, the notion that a two-parent family is superior, not always possible. My parents were divorced. That was not a great thing, but like, you know, it's something that we need to try to achieve. I'm afraid this is something that is not easy to do from the top down. It's something that has to be done, you know, it's going to have to be done from some sort of great awakening here. We need people to you know, do this from the grassroots level. That includes preaching from the pulpit, and it's extremely important. And it's not going to come from the government. It's going to require some ability for the government to step back from these things and not try to force solutions. Because when people are left to their own devices, they tend to figure out the issue of personal responsibility. And you know, we need to be passing on this notion that, hey, you know, graduate from high school, get a job, any job, you know, something to learn the basic skills of being on time and getting the job done. You know, get married, have children after you're married. It's a simple message, and I think it's hugely important, and we've got to figure out how to get it to young people. And I don't know the best way to do that, but I am utterly confident that if we get that message out, we're going to change the world.
Well, please.
One of the reasons we wanted to hold this conference is to have sort of dispassionate discussions about emotional issues. And when we were having that up until this point. We all realize that these are emotional issues, and we don't want to pour gasoline on the fire. We want to sort of bring more light than heat to these discussions. I do want to say, though, that it's quite a spectacle to watch you berate an Asian man for what whites did to blacks.
No, I don't.
Your grievances that you're lecturing him on had nothing to do with Asian Americans doing anything to black people. And the idea that discrimination against Asians is okay because of what whites did to blacks, which is what affirmative action is sold in the name of, makes no sense whatsoever.
I didn't think I did that, and if I did, I apologize for that. All I did was state my personal experience and share them with this audience.
I face.
And it was no personal offense to the gentleman or gentlelady up there. I was just stating everything I talked about was on my personal experience, period.
Well, thanks to everybody. Glad to be able to end on that conciliatory note. And please join me in thanking the panel for our discussion.